Hey everyone, so glad you're joining me for this explainer. If you're gearing up for those upcoming history exams, you are in the exact right place. Today, we're going to map out the shifting global tensions and the massive, absolute game-changing shifts in global security policies that followed the year 2001. We're taking a ton of complex history and turning it into a clear, visual story so you can completely ace your test. Okay, let's just quickly breeze through our roadmap for today. First, context and key vocabulary. Second, 9/11, the catalyst. Third, Afghanistan, the long war. Fourth, Iraq, WMDs and insurgency. Fifth, withdrawals and lingering tensions. And finally, some history practice questions to validate all that hard work. All right, let's jump right into section 1, context and key vocabulary, before the catalyst. So, the absolutely crucial starting point here is establishing this historical timeline. We're looking at a 25-year span, from 1996 to 2021. Think of this as the clothesline on which we're going to hang all of today's really complex cause and effect events. Honestly, memorizing these key dates is going to give you a massive advantage. But before we start tracing that timeline, let's equip you with the essential tools, the key vocabulary you need to actually decode this narrative. Jihad literally refers to a struggle, but in this context, it was weaponized as a call for holy war. Al-Qaeda is the specific extremist network responsible for the 9/11 attacks. The Taliban was the fundamentalist Islamic government ruling Afghanistan that essentially provided a safe haven for Al-Qaeda. WMD stands for weapons of mass destruction, so we're talking nuclear, biological, or chemical weapons. And finally, insurgency. This is an armed rebellion against a constituted authority using irregular warfare. Keep these 5 terms fresh in your mind. You know, the narrative of these shifting global tensions actually starts years before 2001. In this 1996 primary source, Osama bin Laden issued a declaration against the U.S. presence in the Middle East following the Gulf War. He specifically cited American troops in Saudi Arabia as a primary grievance. That right there really sets the stage. Moving right along to section 2, 9/11, the catalyst, a breaking point. Notice the chilling simplicity of the weapon we're looking at here, a standard everyday box cutter. It highlights a terrifying shift in global security toward irregular warfare. I mean, billions of dollars spent on conventional defense systems were completely bypassed by attackers using tiny blades to hijack commercial airplanes and literally turn them into missiles. And the results at the World Trade Center were just devastating. On September 11, 2001, Al-Qaeda attacked the Trade Center in the Pentagon. Nearly 3,000 Americans were killed and billions of dollars in damage were inflicted. This was the first major attack on the American homeland since Pearl Harbor, and it demanded an immediate, entirely unprecedented response. Which brings us to Section 3, Afghanistan, the Long War, immediate response. Following the attacks, President George W. Bush declared a war on terror. In 2001, the US and NATO invaded Afghanistan because, as we defined earlier, it was the base of operations for Al-Qaeda. The military quickly destroyed the Taliban government. But here's the catch. This rapid military victory transitioned into a highly complex 20-year attempt to build a democratic government. It was an effort that ultimately failed, ending with the US withdrawal in 2021 and the Taliban almost immediately retaking power. Now for Section 4, Iraq, WMDs and insurgency. A second theater. For your exams, you absolutely must cleanly separate the immediate policy goals of these two conflicts. Afghanistan was directly tied to 9/11. The goal was to destroy Al-Qaeda and the Taliban. Iraq, however, was invaded later in 2003 with a totally different stated objective: to hunt for weapons of mass destruction and overthrow the Iraqi dictator Saddam Hussein. This political cartoon perfectly captures the central post-9/11 fear that drove that policy. Notice the really thick book titled Iraq's Weapons of Mass Destruction, but the pages, they're completely blank. The great fear was, what if terrorists acquired WMDs from a hostile nation like Iraq? Pre-Gulf War Iraq did have WMD programs, and they impeded international inspections, which completely fueled these massive global anxieties. So in 2003, President Bush issued an ultimatum for Iraq to allow inspections. When Saddam refused, the US invaded. And just like in Afghanistan, the conventional military was defeated incredibly fast. Actually, scratch that. It wasn't just fast. It was a matter of weeks. But then came a grueling, years-long insurgency. And historically, the most controversial aspect of this whole war was that no active WMDs were ever found, leading to intense domestic and international accusations regarding the original justification for the war.
Now, this right here was the brutal reality of our vocabulary word insurgency. What you're seeing is a U.S. Humvee heavily damaged by an improvised explosive device, or IED, in Iraq in 2005. This was the reality of irregular warfare for troops on the ground. They weren't fighting a traditional army standing in uniform. They were fighting hidden insurgents using guerrilla tactics.
On to Section 5, Withdrawals and Lingering Tensions, the Aftermath.
Tracking our timeline forward, President Obama campaigned heavily on ending the Iraq War and officially withdrew U.S. troops in 2011. However, nature abhors a vacuum, and this abrupt withdrawal essentially created a massive power vacuum. Out of the remnants of the insurgency, a radical group known as ISIS rapidly rose to power, violently seizing large parts of Iraq and Syria. The situation became so severe it forced U.S. troops to actually return to the region by 2014.
As history students, analyzing primary source cartoons like these is essential. The cartoon on the left directly compares the chaotic rooftop evacuations of Vietnam to the 2021 withdrawal from Afghanistan, highlighting what the artist sees as a failure to learn from history. On the right, the Iraq War is depicted as a Pandora's box, or quote-unquote, the gift that keeps on giving, out of which the monster of ISIS is unleashed. Both visuals narrate the incredibly difficult long-term consequences of these military campaigns.
Let's wrap things up with Section 6, History Practice. Time to test your knowledge. Try to answer these in your head before I give you the solution, okay? Question 1 asks, what was one major effect of the 1991 Gulf War? Think back to our timeline and bin Laden's 1996 declaration. Have your guess? The correct answer is D. Kuwait was liberated and the U.S. established a permanent military presence in the region to protect oil resources. That permanent presence is exactly what fueled early al-Qaeda grievances. Moving on to question 2. What was the purpose of the Eisenhower Doctrine announced in 1957? This one tests your broader Cold War context in the Middle East. Got it? The answer is C, to give military aid to Middle Eastern countries fighting communism, especially if they were at a high risk of being influenced by the Soviet Union. Finally, question 3. What was the outcome of the Iran hostage crisis of 1979 to 1981? The correct answer here is B. The hostages were released right after President Ronald Reagan took office, ending 444 days of captivity and marking a massive turning point in U.S.-Iran relations that still impacts security today. Excellent job. What we've just mapped out is a quarter-century of profound historical consequences. From the 1996 declarations to the tragedy of 9/11, through the conventional victories and grueling insurgencies of Iraq and Afghanistan, right up to the modern withdrawals. Understanding this chronological chain reaction is exactly what you need to succeed on your exams. So, I want to leave you with one final, pretty provocative thought to chew on. Given the rise of insurgencies and the incredibly complex outcomes of withdrawing from these nations, how do the long-term consequences of the war on terror continue to shape the global security policies we completely rely on today? Keep that question in mind the next time you're scrolling through the news. Thank you so much for learning with me today. Study hard, and I'll catch you on the next explainer.